A huge welcome to everyone on our live stream today. In this session, we will continue our discussions on climate finance and cities. We have here joining us from South Africa, Dr. Meggan Spires. Meggan is the Africa Director of Climate Change and Energy and Resilience. ICLEI, you probably know already, is a global network of more than 2,500 cities and regions committed to sustainable urban development. And Meggan oversees ICLEI's Africa Climate Change, Energy and Sustainable Finance work. She joined around 10 years ago. And since then, Meggan, you've overseen tens of multi-year, multi-country programs and projects in fields such as climate finance, in energy access, climate change adaptation and mitigation projects. That work, you'll tell us more about it. I'm looking forward to that. But it's around unlocking finance for action, capacity building, adaptation and mitigation, political liaison, advocacy, implementation, so a broad breadth of activities. And Meggan also heads up the Secretariat of the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa. That's an initiative that serves almost 400 African cities committed to bold climate change action. It's really fantastic work. Your background, Meggan, is in environmental sciences. You have a PhD from the University of Rhodes, and prior to joining ICLEI Africa, you worked as a climate protection scientist at the eThekwini municipality, and you had involvement in the development of Durban's eThekwini's climate change program. So really fantastic work there. Tell us a bit about yourself, Meggan. What brought you into this work that you currently do? What inspired you to get involved in this?
Thanks, Grant, and thanks very much to the ECO team for inviting ICLEI Africa to share a bit about our climate change and finance work, and looking forward to ongoing partnership with yourselves. I mean, essentially, thinking back to where it all began, and why there is such a passion within me, but also within the broader team to tackle the issues that you mentioned, Grant, in terms of the length and breadth of our work, comes from a place of recognizing the inequality, the equity issue at the heart of climate change, in the sense that those that have done the least to cause the issue are the ones that are the most impacted by it. And we see that in no other place with more clarity than in Africa, in terms of the impacts that we see our cities dealing with really on a day-to-day basis, and the fact that these are now becoming more and more unprecedented, and particularly as we move towards what we are sure we're going to see, unfortunately, which is an overshoot world, a world where we've moved beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius globally. So my journey really began with a passion for the environment, but rooted in justice and people issues, actually. And just thinking back the past 15 years when I began, it was very difficult for me to find a supervisor to supervise both my honors degree and then my PhD degree in climate change. It wasn't a skill set, 15, 20 years ago, where there was a lot of focused practitioners and academics working. And if we think about now, just in terms of how the field has evolved and how many specialities within the climate change field there are, it does, of course, show that there has been progress and attention on the topic, which has been good to see, and it's been good to see this specialization. And then, of course, the work at eThekwini was really foundational to my career and who I am. I got to work very closely with people like Dr. Deborah Roberts, Professor Roberts, who's very well known in the climate change field globally, and particularly in IPCC circles, and really got to get my hands dirty in one city in particular, eThekwini or Durban, in terms of what actually a city in the global south can do to tackle climate change. And I did it a roundabout way, worked for 3 years in a municipality, and then did my PhD. And for me, that was a really good path to follow, because it means the PhD that I focused on climate change adaptation in African cities is a PhD I use every day in my job. And so after receiving that at Rhodes University, joined ICLEI Africa, and have been here very happily working long hours, hard hours here for the last 10 years, trying to really seriously tackle this challenge on this continent that we all care so deeply about.
Fantastic to hear that journey. I mean, starting with climate justice, it really is such a solid foundation of what needs to be done, really, to help address the imbalances and address an issue that is not created by cities and trees in Africa, really. So perhaps for your PhD, getting experience in me, and then doing it so that it's really practical. I've got to notice here that my connection was dropped out for a little bit, so my apologies to everyone if I haven't come through consistently. Hopefully it's back now. Right, so many people are joining us. We've already got 3 people. Mukti joining us from Kathmandu in Nepal. We have Edmund joining us from the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development in Madagascar. Alvaro from Rambøll in Denmark. So we're getting really a global audience already. Please do introduce yourself if you're here. I really want to hear from you. The session will take about an hour, so we may not have time to address everything, but please do ask comments or questions in the do make the comments. We're multi-streaming on LinkedIn and on YouTube, so you can put in comments on either of those platforms and we'll get them here. We'll do our best to deal and address all the comments. If we don't have time, we'll put extra comments in writing. And you can watch a replay of this or share it with your colleagues and friends straight after the event. They're available on both platforms, so you can do that. So if you're joining us live, let's put in your comments. If you're joining us after the event, put in your comments and questions in the comments section, and we'll respond to them. Right, so that's a whole lot of introduction, and fantastic to hear your experiences there, Meggan. We're going to talk about a number of issues, how cities have really become key players and actually perhaps drives in the global climate, the role of networks like ICLEI in supporting climate-led and city-led climate action. We're going to talk about some of the challenges and enablers that you have from your practical experience in this, and what's missing around coordination capacity and the financial architecture. So yes, please do put in your comments, introduce yourself. Fantastic to see so many people connect from around the world. So from your experience, how have you seen the role of cities evolve, Meggan, in this climate change? How have all in this?
Thanks, Grant. So I mean, I think the city's agenda, goes without saying, has risen in importance, and we see this in multiple fronts. I mean, one is that we've seen in every COP decision, in a sense, cities and multi-level governance have received more attention, and that doesn't happen by chance. That happens when city networks like ICLEI, but we have many other city networks that we work with, coordinated through what we call the LGMA constituency to the UNFCCC. So LGMA stands for Local Governments and Municipal Authorities Constituency. ICLEI's been the focal point over the past 3 decades, and the point there is to mobilize all of those that are working at the city scale through a coordinated platform to feed into the UNFCCC processes. And, you know, in part, that is why we've seen over the years this increasing in focus on cities and subnational governments as key players in achieving national goals and objectives in the climate change space. The Paris Agreement has done that. We've had initiatives like CHAMP come forward, where national governments, more than 80 of them, have signed to say we will include subnational governments more coherently and effectively in the revisions of our nationally determined contributions. We will include subnational governments in our thinking about how we get finance flowing, particularly to the local level. And these type of global advocacy efforts matter, because ultimately what they lead to is sea changes in focus in terms of global, regional, and then national focal areas, but also in the initiation of funded programs. So, we're always saying as city networks that we're trying to balance advocacy, which is essential, but also then with direct implementation on the ground. And these two things should work in concert. So what's implemented on the ground should be influencing what's being done in the global advocacy space, because there's a grounding and a ground truthing of what's really important to be taken into the international scale. But likewise, what has been negotiated at these UN conferences has a direct impact on those implementing on the ground, and trying to ensure that there's alignment between the two is really a key role that we play as networks. So we've definitely seen progress there and within the UNFCCC. On the IPCC front, we've also seen progress. So, we'll know, most in this room will know that there's now a special report on cities that is being developed, and ourselves as city networks, as practitioners, but also academics across the world, are now writing really action-oriented academic pieces about what cities could and should be doing from the peer-reviewed literature to tackle climate change. And so there are these global shifts that we've seen, but we've also seen this almost in every country in which we work, in which national governments are recognizing the importance of making sure that the right mandates fall at the right level of government. So as ICLEI, we would always say that multi-level governance is essential, and that mandates should fall where they make the most sense. And certainly in relation to climate change adaptation, which is, one could argue, one of the biggest priorities for the African continent, here cities play an absolutely crucial role, because one cannot implement adaptation without involving the government tier that is closest to the people. When there are floods in Durban or droughts in Lusaka, where do the people go? They go to the mayor, they go to the city hall. And so it's really important for these players to have a loud and a strong voice in determining progress going forward. Certainly an area where, and I think we'll come to that later, there is still a lot of work to be done is in the finance space, and is trying to tackle this issue of how do we get funding flowing to where it's needed most, and ultimately that's at the local level. So, whether you're implementing a climate change mitigation energy project and installing a solar farm, or you're doing river rehabilitation to deal with the climate change impact, that funding needs to get to the local level, and as much funding as possible needs to get to the local level, so that we can see tangible improvements in the lives of those that are most affected by climate change. So that for us as ICLEI Africa has become a significant focus of our work. Of course, we'll always continue to do our policy and our planning and our advocacy and our capacity building work, but implementation and finance is now our primary focus. And because we're city-led, because we're a membership-based organization, because we're guided by our mayors and our city managers, that is ever more so our priority, because there is frustration, particularly in the global South and African context, around lack of action. And so our focus really in all its entirety is how could we move quicker from talk, from planning to actual implementation. And here capacity is a key issue, but finance, of course, becomes absolutely critical.
Yeah, fantastic. Great focus then on mobilizing finance for local action. I'm very much struck by that relationship, I guess, between, you talked about multi-level governance and the need for that, and essentially making sure that finance gets down to the local level. Could you just, because those are, there's high level and local level. Can you just tell us a bit about the strategies that ICLEI uses to do that? You've got to engage with local stakeholders, with communities, residents, informal settlements and such like, and also be working at perhaps city level governance and other levels of governance. And just to mention before you answer that, Meggan, there's a link here to ICLEI Africa in the QR code. Please do scan that to find out more about the fantastic work that you're doing.
Sure, thanks, Grant. Thanks, Silas. I mean, in terms of multi-level governance, of course, one has methodologies and tools that can be deployed. I mean, one of the biggest things, it sounds very simple, but often just getting these stakeholders in the same room and allowing a neutral platform in which very frank, transparent conversations can be had is really crucial. I think we often underestimate the value of a neutral convening partner. And ICLEI is not the only one, right? We're one of many that can convene these stakeholders to have structured, facilitated, grounded, transparent conversations around what is and isn't possible. And often what you find in these contexts, like in any organization, there are coordination challenges. In every country, of course, there are coordination challenges. And the biggest value add we feel at least we can offer is to help in joining the dots, is to help in overcoming situations in which you may have two departments implementing similar pieces of work, in creating more efficiencies in how government spends its budget, and in looking at the policies that are in place and really trying to leverage what are the opportunities within government policies, but then also who are the MDBs playing in that particular country? Who are the DFIs that are interested in funding work in that particular country? And making those linkages, assisting government ultimately in making those linkages so that deals can ultimately be made and funding can flow. And to give a tangible example, we've been working for many years in South Africa and in particular with the Development Bank of Southern Africa, who's one of those leading DFIs that has identified the importance of finance flowing to the subnational scale and has shown initiative and drive in actually setting up programs and initiatives that are focused at the subnational level. And we're always pushing this in our advocacy work to say that facilities that banks or DFIs set up with the primary mechanism of providing sovereign loans don't always work at the subnational level. There's a different stakeholder that one is engaging in this space. There's different risks. There's different languages that are utilized. There's different mandates. And so having a DFI like a DBSA that's specifically looking at what it can do, what role it can play in helping to mobilize finance for South African municipalities, but DBSA now has a mandate for working across the continent, is for us really pivotal. And so we've been working with them here in South Africa, particularly on trying to get embedded generation projects implemented more widely in South African municipalities, not just to tackle what we call in South Africa load shedding, which is ultimately that power goes off for certain portions of the day, but also in terms of security of supply, and then of course all the climate change benefits of moving towards renewable energy. And what is the role that we play, right? This joining the dot role. I mean, one is that we've got very enabling policy in South Africa as an example for energy decentralization, but applying that at the municipal context is often missing. And then being very clear about what is or isn't the role of municipalities. And this is a more general, broader lesson that is not just from our South African work, but from our work across the continent, is being really realistic about what is or isn't the role of each of the players in the finance pipeline. I get very frustrated attending conferences, webinars, meetings where there is sometimes, and I don't think it's perhaps often intentional, this raise of expectations around these apparent climate funds that are somewhere out there in the ether in the global landscape, and that, if you just develop a project that is what one would call investment ready or bankable, there's this flow that's going to hit your doorstep of finance. And the reality is working in the municipal context is very difficult. It's seen as relatively high risk. And so we need to be realistic and fair and transparent with all players in this landscape about what role each one can play. And it's not always that the municipality itself is going to take the loan and take the finance onto their own balance sheet. There's different ownership models. There's different structures of deals that can work, that make more sense in certain contexts versus others. And being able to have those straight conversations while understanding we go nation by nation, each national finance ecosystem more coherently, that for me is crucial in moving us forward and away from what has happened quite often in the past, I feel at least, which is a lot of talk around this funding out there and then this frustration of how do I access it? What can I do to access it? And that's certainly a request we've received as a network very many times over the years.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. One question coming now, very quickly deal with, is just that, is it possible to have a recording? And just want to tell Edmund and everyone else watching that you can watch it in the same location straight after the event. If you're joining us on LinkedIn or on YouTube, you'll be able to connect like that. A number of points you made, well, so many great points there, and I can only pick up on a few of them. You talked about having great enabling policies specifically related to embedded generation or distributed generation in South Africa, but the trouble being applying those policies. So that's the one aspect of it. And then I was very struck by what you said about ensuring that the roles are clear. This idea, in a way, there's a huge gulf between, hey, there's all this climate finance available, you just have to apply for it, and then actually who's responsible, who's going to take that forward, how will it be mobilized in this particular case, country by country, as you said. Maybe you could just say a few words around that gulf. I mean, how does one ensure that the correct players at each level, maybe the DBSA as an example of regional development bank is a key player in this, as I think you actually said or hinted on.
Sure. So, I think I would respond to that by saying that despite being a city network, so ultimately our core stakeholder group is subnational governments, we are doing more and more work with national governments. We always have, right? One can't work in a country without national government endorsements, and more work with the private sector. Why? Because if you look at how do you get finance flowing, those are really two pivotal players. National government has got to facilitate access to local players of finance, and certain countries are more advanced in this than others, and also because we find, of course, there's lessons in terms of methodologies that can be applied in different countries, but every country is unique in terms of what is its national policies, what is its priorities, what donors are interested in funding or financing that country, which often has a lot to do with geopolitics, not just technical feasibility of projects, and then who are the big players that one needs to join the dots within that particular country. So our approach now in terms of methodology, as I alluded to earlier, is to go country by country, and we start with a national stakeholder mapping, which sounds like a simple task, but getting that right and keeping that as a living document that's evolving over time is absolutely crucial. And through that process, you identify who are the key players that we need to bring together, when. And I'm highlighting the when because I think, also just to reflect on lessons, I think it's always important to speak about failures or lessons as much as it is to speak about successes, is that a few years ago, we brought chief financial officers and treasurers into the conversation too early. These individuals working in municipalities want to be talking when there's a deal to be made, and they don't want their time wasted. And so the when question is really crucial. When do you bring the private sector in? What motivates them to act? What are their mandates? And legitimacy of processes comes down to not only is this of interest to me, i.e. will this help me do my job better? That's how everybody is motivated. But also, have you brought me in at the appropriate time that I feel like it's a useful use of my time and I'm going to see things progress to the next step? So this for me has been the pieces of the puzzle we've needed to put together to actually progress the conversation forward, and that stakeholder mapping is absolutely crucial. And another significant piece for us is transparency. So to use examples, because I think it's always useful to embed it in something in reality. We've been working in Cameroon for a number of years now, and particularly with FACOM, which is the organization responsible for financial flows through to Cameroonian local governments. So a key player in the landscape to ensuring that, in particular, climate finance gets down to the local level. And we've partnered with them in developing a tool which basically maps the adaptation finance flows in the country. And this transparency piece is key, not only in a country being able to identify where are the gaps. So when I'm engaging, whether it's a high level meeting at a UN conference or with a bank on an individual bilateral basis, what actually am I asking for? Where is funding already flowing in my country? And what can I learn also from that funding being implemented, so that we're not reinventing the wheel every time we implement a particular program? And the second piece we've done with FACOM is to assist them in developing a climate finance window, and they've issued that window. They've called for project proposals, and now they have a pipeline. And just a point on pipeline maybe, and talking more now to the finance work. For us, we've had to work at both ends of the scale. So on the supply side, we've had to work very much with MDBs and DFIs to understand what are the criteria that they utilize when evaluating projects. And we get different levels of transparency depending on the DFI or MDB that we work with, so that we can pick up what are red herrings, what are red flags, what are the, it's not as simple as just saying, is a project bankable or not? Every DFI and MDB has certain criteria. And so really trying to understand that landscape very clearly, and then also on a country by country basis. But then also on the demand side, and this going back to the FACOM example, is in developing pipelines, but good quality pipelines. If we were all sitting on, and again, I can say we get daily requests almost, ICLEI Africa, what's your pipeline for this country? ICLEI Africa, what's your pipeline for this country? We need good quality pipelines, and this is a combination of looking at things like the creditworthiness of who's submitting the projects, the ticket sizes of the projects, and understanding what different players are willing to fund depending on ticket sizes, so that you're tailoring your pipeline also to who you're speaking to, and you're not necessarily pitching projects. And this is why I've tended not to like matchmaking events, which are still a bit of a rage in the finance space, because matchmaking done badly leads to a city presenting a project that small scale, maybe a nature-based solutions projects in their city that they're really passionate about, to a donor or a DFI that has a ticket size upwards of $7 million US. There's a complete mismatch. And we shouldn't be, for us that are playing in this intermediary space, we should be avoiding that situation happening, because not only does it lead to mismatched expectations, but it increases this frustration around how do we actually get finance going. So, in summary, in response to your question, Grant, I would say, how critical that stakeholder mapping is, and that needs to, in our opinion, needs to be done nation by nation. Of course, there's methodologies that can be applied. And then the second key piece is this supply and demand matching that needs to be done with much more thought and carefulness, so that we're not ultimately wasting people's time, because wasting people's time is wasting what is a lot of times taxpayers' money through grant-funded projects.
Okay. Yeah, that second part, that matching, has to do with the role, and I really liked how you connected the stakeholder mapping, not just to who is there, but when do those particular stakeholders need to be involved. And there's many things I would love to dig down into, but perhaps we could just start really around. So we've talked about some of the players like a development bank, national government within your subnational government within a city perhaps, or a region. When you take it down to the local level, what about those stakeholders there? How do you and how would you engage with local stakeholders, or advise cities to engage with local stakeholders, communities, residents, informal settlements? How do you take that level, and actually then when's the right moment to be engaging with the local stakeholders?
Yeah. So this is a crucial point, and actually I did a bit of work earlier in my career on what would be called community-based adaptation, and it's really challenging because no one city is the same. Within a city, there is so much diversity, depending on the informal settlement one is engaging with, or the segment of the municipality one is engaging with. And I don't think there's any wisdom in trying to downplay that complexity. So what we're constantly struggling with is wanting pace, so we need to speed up delivery. Now, obviously, speeding up delivery often means stronger, more unilateral decision-making with engagement, with adequate participation that really brings along communities in the process. And I don't think anyone has the silver bullet here. We certainly don't. It's a day-to-day balance between how do we hear the diversity from those living on the ground, but then also make sure that there's progress, because one can get caught into constant engagement with multi groups at all times. And I think one of our biggest lessons here actually is humility. Because you go into these spaces, I think particularly of our informal settlement work in Beira in Mozambique, in eThekwini in Uganda, where we're implementing a clean cooking project with Carbon Trust and others. And the perception is this is a disorganized space, informal settlements. Look, it's so informal. The reality is these communities often are highly organized. They have their own community-based structures. They have their own ways. Sometimes it's based, in some context on tribal leaders. Other times it's simply based on community leaders. And our approach is always build on what's already there. Please, don't come in and impose some kind of mechanism into these communities. And so our approach is always to go in, to really listen, to make sure that we've got ultimately either staff or well-known consultants or NGOs or CBOs that we work with that know the context well, that we really listen to and figure out what are the mechanisms in place in that particular context that we can harness to feed that information in the correct ways through to local governments and then ultimately through to national governments. So my response to that would be to say, listen, be humble, and build on what are already often existing, highly functional community-led mechanisms to inform your project or your plan to make sure that it's implemented more effectively. And the strongest example I have of where we've actually seen this is from our eThekwini work, where we're implementing a project focused on alleviating largely flood-related climate change impacts. And eThekwini municipality has for many years been a leader in climate change adaptation, which is interesting because, historically cities have often had a mitigation focus because of the greenhouse gas push. And the municipality has been really intentional about liaising with informal settlements through WhatsApp groups and disasters and existing structures they have in place to deal with disasters. So much so, and so effectively so, that now if you speak to the mayor of eThekwini municipality or a council of eThekwini municipality, they can hand on heart with all legitimacy say that through certain interventions they've made collaborating with local communities, lives have been saved. They will say on public platforms, this many lives have been saved due to our collaboration with communities and us being able to mobilize them effectively when disasters are going to hit to aid their evacuation. And for me, that's crucial. We know where we're going globally. We see the geopolitical shifts. We know there's cuts in aid funding. And if we as organizations working in the space do not get better at ensuring our projects are delivering tangible results, good proof points that deliver on multiple SDGs at one time, funding going to this type of work is simply going to get less and less. And for me, being able to actually, where it's legitimate, putting a quantitative number to lives saved is not only good because it means lives were saved, of course, but it's also good in thinking about how we finance this work going forward.
Okay, so part of that is actually through their practical experience, city governments they really realize the value of the input from the local communities. I mean, that's a diversity. You talked about listening with humility, not coming with ready answers as well, which is just music to my ears. I always think the first step is to find out what people are doing, understand the world from other people's perspective. I just coming in and saying, oh, it's chaos here, doesn't really get to the ground of actually those people in their lives day to day, how they're doing, how they're managing things. And we often get a surprise when we realize how there are systems, they're just not systems that we're perhaps familiar with or that we see at first sight there. We're getting some questions, and I want to transition to them. Not too many questions, and I think what one of our listeners has said, this is a great conversation, learning a lot from it. So I think lots of people are hanging on your every word, Meggan, and perhaps not then typing in questions. But we have a few here, and one of them from a LinkedIn user, the name is not available here, is how can we deal with the political interest versus the technical and long-term approach of climate change when developing or prioritizing investments at the city level? How do you deal with that, Meggan?
Welcome to the ICLEI Life. This is a challenge for any organization that's working at the interface of politics and then technical delivery. And of course, you know, in contexts where you have mayoral changes, I mean, we work in some contexts, like in Mauritius, where mayors and political leadership at the city scale changes on a 6-monthly basis. One wants to avoid the loss of progress. And so our approach is always to tailor our work so that we're not just working with politicians, because political will is absolutely pivotal, but also with the technical arms within city governments that tend to last beyond political iterations, even if there's a change often of political party, is to make sure that the technical officials are also taken along with us. So this is always a combination of mayor or governor, as well as town clerk or city manager and their various teams. So that's one of the crucial ways we've seen in being able to tie the two together. You know, the other piece is, I mean, ultimately, if we're doing what we should be doing, which is improving development, and I always, you know, I don't think it's news to anyone. My take is always that climate change is a developmental issue as much as it is an environmental issue. If the work being done is of value and it leads to good development and it benefits people on the ground, for me, it doesn't matter what politician comes into power, even if there's a change in the technical arm of government. If you're clear about being clear about the value add that links to good development and SDGs, and then obviously you tailor your messaging depending on who you're speaking to, then there's always going to be buy-in for that work going forward. So I think that combination of political, technical engagements, making sure that you articulate clearly the value add of your work from a good development perspective. Ultimately, we've at least seen long-term sustainability. And maybe the last thing I would say on sustainability is making sure there's buy-in from who you are engaging with, and as a development aid partner, and sometimes taking a step back. What I mean by that is what you ultimately want to see is that the policies or the plans that you've worked with the city to develop are owned by that city. So I always much prefer having the opportunity of a city, of a region being able to say to us, please mainstream climate change, biodiversity, whatever the topic is, into our existing development plans, as opposed to what we've seen a lot of, let's be honest, in years gone past, separate policies and plans that are often developed by development partners that very often simply get left on shelves. I would much rather be involved in a mainstreaming exercise than a separate document exercise, even if there are some donors out there that may like that. And making sure that there is buy-in and recognition of that policy and that plan in that government. And again, maybe to give a good example, we've seen in Uganda, this is through support of the UK government, of FCDO, to the establishment of a clean cooking unit within the national government structures. You know, that's a game changer. That's a donor being willing to recognize that institutional placement is critical for longevity, and building the institutional capacity in that government to take the work that donor and others are implementing, in this case on clean cooking going forward, is crucial. So, work should not just be focused on, I developed a policy, I rolled out clean cooking to 20,000 people. What is the institutional structure that's going to be maintained long-term in that government agency to make sure that those impacts are long-term, but also that they can be scaled through other governments or private sector-led programming?
Yeah, I love that. Often donors are not really keen to support that institutional building. They're looking at isolated projects that take forward some policy instruments and such, like leaving the institution to the national players to create somehow spontaneously out of it. So it's interesting to hear of that example in Uganda. Another question coming in, I think this relates to it. This is perhaps a broad question from Nigus here on LinkedIn. He's commenting that in developing countries, it's really hard to mobilize at the local level. You mentioned that right near the start, Meggan, it's around local action and getting the finance to it. Do you want to give some pointers to Nigus about how to handle that situation? How do you go about mobilizing the resource for local needs?
Yeah, my biggest message is engage with your national governments. The reality is, if we just simply, there's two pieces, right? If you're looking at significant finance, so we're talking, large ticket sizes projects, infrastructure type programming, the reality is that is going to be primarily implemented from a financing perspective via loan finance, okay? And the reality there is that if we just look at the international financial architecture, most of this finance is going to be sovereign-backed loans. So, national governments ultimately are going to have to be the ones taking that loan, or in some cases, we see this with first loss facilities, they back their local government, or there's some, in isolated cases in Africa at least, where municipalities or cities themselves have the creditworthiness or balance sheet or both to take direct loans themselves for infrastructure projects. There are metropolitan municipalities in South Africa that can do this. In North Africa, there's a number of cities. Lagos in Nigeria is another example. But in a sense, if you think of how many local governments there are in Africa, these cases are few and far between. Does that mean we can't get finance to the local level? No. The first thing is to look at urban programming that's coordinated and led within national government structures involving lower tiers of government. And we've seen this push globally for what is often spoken about as national platforms. And for us, with our partners, we're often pushing for what would be called national urban platforms. So this is urban programming that's led at the national government level. And what this does is it either allows the flow of sovereign loans through national governments to the local level, or what it allows is what we've seen with maybe a little bit less success because it can lead to complexity, is pooling of projects. So coordination of projects and getting to the right ticket sizes that can allow finance to flow. But that's the loan space, right? And there's green bonds, a whole conversation there too. But there's also this space around who are the other players and what's the existing domestic finance flows that can fund the smaller scale implementation of projects. And this is a nuanced conversation, again, country by country, that one needs to look at what are the existing funding flow mechanisms that exist, what are the existing domestic resources available, and how do we mainstream climate resilientify those interventions. The other big piece, which speaks a bit more to our private sector work, is, and I was looking actually earlier this morning, somebody sent me a graph which showed the percentage of climate finance continent by continent between public and private sector. And you see in global north countries and continents that private sector is providing the vast majority of climate finance. In Africa, it's a tiny smidgen, it's a tiny proportion. Mm-hmm. And this is a really interesting one for me in the sense that in Africa, it's a different ballgame in many ways, but also because we have a massive private sector held by small and medium-sized enterprises and those operating in informal settlements. And in many senses, these type of finance flows, I don't think, are being monitored with any kind of transparency. But also this leads, to the question of risk, right? So that the space is seen to be risky, and private sector doesn't like risk. It's profit based largely. So going back to my point around involvement of private sector, and again, just to give a tangible example, talking to our clean cooking work, we've been implementing a program called ENACT under the Transformative Energy Access Program, which is a UK-funded program, UK aid-funded program, to try and use grant finance catalytically. And, for me, it always has been the case, but even more so now, there's two gates for grant finance. Number one, grant finance should only be spent on work that can't be done without grant finance. And number two, grant finance has to be spent with the end goal of finance. I normally refer to grant as funding and finance as finance, right?
Yeah.
And so in the case of this clean cooking work, what we've done is used a catalytic grant finance facility to help small and medium-sized enterprises operating in the clean cooking space to get their technologies from not financially viable in informal settlements to financially viable in informal settlements. And why is that crucial? Number one, it's crucial because it's unlocking the private sector. And number two, it's crucial because it's not grant finance forever. It's grant finance to get to a financially viable case in which you now have small businesses creating jobs in their national context and able to operate on their own steam. And I think that's ultimately where we should be trying to go with as much of our grant finance as we have access to.
Yeah, I've just been saying a very similar thing. So it's music to my ears to hear you saying that idea of using grant finance in a catalytic way to mobilize other finance. Can I just very briefly circle around to the issue of climate justice? Because a lot of people are saying adaptation, it should be grant funded because it's not our problem. It was not caused by us. It should be grants. Why are we talking about loans in this context? Could you say just a couple of words around that?
Yeah, it's a really difficult space, and we're navigating this because ultimately, our role is often like, how do we unlock finance for our global South or our African stakeholders? And so we hear that call all of the time. I think that the argument is sound, particularly when one talks about grant finance for activities that wouldn't be possible without grant finance. And I think adaptation in a lot of context falls into this bucket. We've been tracking and are still to see, the progress made on the loss and damage fund, and how much that is or isn't going to allow direct access, and the scale of that finance, and who's it truly going to benefit. I think that's one example where we could see some kind of game-changing initiative that leads to real impact on the ground utilizing grant finance. But then this other piece of, in essence, there is a need for skin in the game from the national or the local governments. And we've certainly seen, even when grant or loan finance is provided from a global North donor or player, the value of a local player simply being able to say, I'm coming in with some kind of, either it's a financial contribution or it's an in-kind contribution. And this is where I think often those of us working in the global South underplay what we have to offer. There's often a lot of in-kind resources that are offered by government entities, working on programming and contributing to these kinds of activities. And then other things that need to be better evaluated. If I just think of in the embedded generation space, there's some intermediate municipalities that they themselves are not going to take the loan. Maybe they're not going to do the offtake agreement, but there is land, right, that's within a municipal context. And that can be a substantial contribution into these kinds of conversations. So it's also often a leverage power conversation as much as it's about fairness in implementation. And this is I don't want to say it's a global fight, but it does feel a bit like that, in the sense that we're obviously very worried about some of the movements we've seen globally, particularly in certain countries. An inward lookingness and inward to my nation lookingness, a pushback against multilateralism. So we certainly stand very strongly on two principles. I mean, one is the absolute importance of multilateralism. It's going to be interesting to see how the UN is changing and evolving. There's been some leaked documents out on evolutions that are happening there, but I think, of course, we're all looking at ourselves around how do we create more efficiency in the utilization of grant finance and in these big organizations themselves to create more efficiencies. So that's the one piece, but then also very strong on justice and fairness and equity. And we'll keep banging on that drum, doing whatever we can with players, but also having to be really realistic and pragmatic also about where the world is going. And sometimes it's simply also about looking at priorities of these players. It may not be tagged as a climate change intervention anymore because of a shift in national priority. It may be tagged as a water intervention or a food intervention. But through smart implementation, we of course need to make sure that water or that food intervention is also beneficial from a climate change perspective.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Noah asks, as a local NGO, how can you establish an effective partnership to raise resources for community development? Meggan, one of the things you said, just to remind the listeners, is that there are national platforms that are perhaps the appropriate bodies to mobilize funding for the local level. Urban programming, you talked about urban platforms and such like. Perhaps Noah's touching a little bit on this. You're there at a local NGO. What do you do in order to start?
Yeah. I mean, for me, gold in this space is networks. Unfortunately or fortunately, in a lot of these spaces, it's knowing who to speak to. It's who it's the right network. So that would be my one advice. If I was speaking to a local NGO implementing really catalytic, amazing work in their context, would be do whatever you can to get connected. And then the second would be very clear about what is the niche or the value add that you offer. And the more it can be, in a sense, what only you can offer, which of course it can be, because everyone's individual and every organization is established for a certain region, and being really crystal clear about that can help in mobilizing resources. And then the third point would be, in those contexts in which, say, you're attempting to raise resources, is making sure that you're tailoring what you can do to who you're speaking to, because every organization, every donor, every funder, every financier has certain goals, objectives, mandates, agendas that they are attempting to achieve. And partnerships, from my perspective, always work best when everyone's clear, as one can be. What are my objectives? What am I aiming to get out of this partnership? And it being fair. And I think if that is done in a way that's open and transparent and collaborative, one can tend to move forward in terms of raising resources.
Okay, so get out there and network, connect, make sure what you're doing is known within the country. Build those partnerships. I think perhaps you've already addressed this point that is raised by Ignacio. She's from Argentina. You've talked with so many inspiring ideas and thoughts about how you go about doing things. She's asking practically, what are the lessons learned from in Africa that could be relevant in the rest of the world? Perhaps this is a chance for you to sort of summarize some of those key lessons that you've been talking about during this session.
Yeah. So I think for me, my best examples are where there is a partnership with what I would call the end game. So this is the DFI or the MDB that's willing to intersect at the city or the subnational scale. So, we're having conversations now with EBRD, for instance, that's coming into sub-Saharan Africa. That's a bank, for instance, that has, direct mechanisms for direct lending into the subnational space. And I gave the DBSA example in which they've got actual facilities that they've set up with de-risking mechanisms that can get finance flowing to the local level. So for me, the biggest lesson that can be perhaps scaled in other global south countries, but I would even hazard a guess that would be useful in the global north, is to be having those conversations with the DFIs and the MDBs at play about what are first of all, are they interested? Are they mobilized in the urban subnational space? I mean, that's the first thing, obviously, of course, to clarify. And then the second is, if they do, what are the mechanisms available to them that could be deployed with the stakeholders that you are engaging with. And there you see, for me, food for your labor, because what you're doing is you're bringing the supply and the demand side more effectively together, as opposed to, what we did in the early days in our climate finance work, which was to generate pipelines. And a lot of the projects in these pipelines were ultimately not financeable. They were really small scale projects that had value of themselves, but there was so much work to be done to get them to pre-feasibility and feasibility stage. So I think, partnering on both ends of the spectrum in whatever context you're operating is where you're ultimately going to see the most success. And to give a tangible example from the work I referred to right in the beginning with DBSA, we're now seeing actual municipal-led projects sitting in a DBSA project preparation facility, receiving dedicated DFI support to do the due diligence to ultimately get them closer to financial close. And that's really all we want to see. And, we're putting so much effort and time into this work because my perspective is we just need 1, 2, 3 intermediate municipalities to get their projects through to implementation. When I say their project, doesn't mean they own the project. They don't necessarily take the loan, but it's their project because they've led the development of the project. For us to start to change the mindsets of the private sector, of DFIs, of MDBs around the riskiness of subnationals for finance. And that's what we'll do all our work in doing. And, as we get to different junctures of success, communicating that effectively to change the mindset, because that mindset shift is absolutely necessary.
Okay. So Ignacio, hopefully that's some useful inputs and insight. It's the engagement at the MDB level. It could be national or regional or global MDB, those that are able to function at the subnational level, and engaging with them. Very important point you're also making, Meggan, about addressing both the demand side and the supply side. Otherwise, you end up with a pipeline that sits on a shelf somewhere there. This has been really fantastic chat. We run out of time, but perhaps you want to say sorry, I didn't mean to turn that one on. Perhaps you'd like to say some sort of closing words, encouragement to the audience. People have been really engaged and hanging on your every word.
Thanks, Grant. I mean, just to say thanks to everyone that attended. We're coming from a space of learning and humility. We're always open. Please, you can reach to me or to our organization through our different channels. We want to hear what work's happening in your context and how it could be implemented in Africa. And I think the encouragement is really, I see it almost as a cohort of the willing. Who is it of us that really deeply care about our cities and about the communities, particularly, the poor that are the most impacted by climate change. We need encouragement because we're in a difficult space. We're in a difficult global geopolitical space. And so, these types of things like what ECO is leading, these webinars, these live LinkedIn interviews, they're essential because they're keeping us motivated and inspired and driving us forward. And in times like these, it's absolutely essential.
Yeah, thank you very much, Meggan. My team is hugely enthusiastic. Just wanting to mention that they've worked on this the midterm review of the FCDO Modern Cooking Energy Services project, and are thrilled to note that initiative that you mentioned in Uganda. That's part of this, giving motivation to one another. It's really fantastic. So please do, if this has worked for you, it's been an interesting thing, share it with your networks. It'll be available immediately after the call so people can watch it, and we'll extract some pieces as well. I'm sure you can get it on YouTube, you can get it on LinkedIn. So share it with your network. Share the amazing things that we've been hearing from Meggan. Great to hear it. If you want to hear more about ECO, there's a little QR code you can scan up in the top here. But thanks to everyone. Thanks to Patricia, to Sandy, to Mariella, who've been in the background making everything work smoothly. Really appreciate it. And thank you, of course, Meggan. It's just been a real pleasure to speak with you, hear so many wise words, so much experience. Really fantastic. Very much appreciated. We'll be in touch.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.